Tonight we're going to travel back to a time so distant that its memory clings to the world only in the shape of old stone walls and the faint outlines of ridges left by long vanished ploughs. A time when the winter wind carried the smell of wood smoke across snow-covered fields for miles, when the sound of a church bell could be heard from one village to the next across the frozen countryside, and when the coming of the cold season was not a matter of inconvenience, but a slow, patient reckoning between the fragility of the human body and the vast, indifferent power of the natural world. A time when nightfall began in mid-afternoon, when a single ember tended carefully through the long hours of darkness, could mean the difference between life and death, and when every family in every village huddled close around a small fire, listening to the wind cry through the eaves, and prayed quietly that they had gathered enough to see them through to spring. This is the story of the medieval winter. Not the winter of storybook illustrations, with rosy-cheeked children skating on frozen ponds and jolly peasants raising cups of steaming wine, but the real winter, the true winter, the winter that shaped centuries of human ingenuity, and claimed countless lives each year in the cold, quiet corners of Europe. It is a story of resilience, of hardship, of community, and of the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned, through bitter trial and error, how to survive months of darkness with only the tools their own hands could shape and the knowledge their own memories could hold. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, slow journeys into forgotten worlds, do consider leaving a like or subscribing so we can continue making them together. I always find myself curious about who is listening, so if you feel inclined, leave a comment with your location and the time it is there. It always astonishes me how a single quiet voice can find its way into so many bedrooms across the world, each of them a small pocket of warmth, each of them, in its own way, a distant echo of the hearth fires we are about to visit. But for now, get truly comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull the blanket a little higher, let your shoulders soften into the mattress, and let your mind begin to drift toward that older world, that colder world, that world of long shadows and small fires, where our story is about to begin. Close your eyes for a moment and let the modern world quietly fall away. The distant hum of electricity fades into silence. The pale glow of street lamps vanishes. The soft, ever-present light of screens dissolves into nothing, and in its place there is only the deep, unbroken darkness of a medieval night. Above you, the stars are more brilliant than you have ever seen them, sharp as chips of ice, uncorrupted by any artificial light for hundreds of miles in every direction. The air is so still and cold that you can hear the faint creak of frozen branches from half a mile away. Beneath that endless canopy of frost-bright stars lies a small village in the north of England, cradled between low hills and the black skeletons of leafless trees. The year is 1348. The first true snow has not yet fallen, but the world is on the very edge of transformation. The air itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for the season to turn. The village has no name that would ever appear on a modern map. It is a scattering of perhaps 30 homes clustered around a small stone church, a manor house set on a low rise, a mill beside a slow, dark stream, and fields laid out in long, narrow strips that fan out from the centre, like the petals of some ancient, half-forgotten flower. The homes themselves are humble things, low and squat, built from timber frames filled with woven sticks and coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung. To modern eyes, they might look like little more than glorified huts, sagging beneath their heavy thatched roofs, but to the families who live inside them, they are something far more precious. They are the difference between life and death. We are going to spend our time this evening with one such family. Their name is Ashcombe, and they live in a single-room cottage on the western edge of the village, tucked against a low stone wall that separates their small garden plot from the common pasture beyond. The head of the household is a man named Alwyn Ashcombe. He is 41 years old, which in this century makes him an elder statesman of the village. His hands are thick and calloused from decades of labour, his back permanently curved from years of stooping over the earth, and his beard, once dark as ploughed soil, is now streaked liberally with grey. Beside him lies his wife Aldith, who is 38, a strong woman with steady hands and eyes that miss very little. Together they have 3 children who have survived past infancy, a rarity in these times. Their eldest is a boy of 16 named Godric, already nearly as tall as his father, and considered fully a man by the standards of the village. Then there is their daughter Hild, who is 12 and possessed of a quiet, watchful nature. And finally, there is the youngest, a small boy of 7 called Wulfric, who still sleeps curled between his sister and mother for warmth on the coldest nights. This particular evening in early November, the family has just finished the last of their preparations for winter. The Feast of St. Martin, which falls on the 11th of the month, marks in medieval tradition the true beginning of the cold season. It is on this day that animals are slaughtered, meat is preserved, and the community holds its final great gathering before the world contracts inward, before every family retreats into its own small circle of firelight and shared body heat to wait out the long dark months ahead. For weeks now, the Ashcombs have been working from before dawn until well after dusk, driven by a single urgent knowledge that presses upon every medieval farmer at this time of year. There will be no second chance. Whatever they have gathered, preserved and stored is all they will have until the earth grows warm again. If they have miscalculated, if their preparations fall short by even a small margin, then somewhere in the deep cold of February or the hungry weeks of March, they will feel the consequences in the hollow of their bellies and the weakness of their limbs. Alwyn lies on his straw-stuffed mattress and stares up into the darkness of the rafters above him. He cannot see them clearly in the dim orange glow of the banked hearth fire, but he knows every beam by heart. He knows which one bears the deepest smoke stain from 40 winters of use. He knows which one his father repaired the year the great oak fell in the storm. And he knows, hanging from those blackened beams tonight, the shapes of the family's winter fortune. Hams and shoulders of pork, wrapped and tied with cord, curing slowly in the constant rising smoke. Bundles of dried herbs, thyme and sage and rosemary and pennyroyal, gathered in the summer and hung upside down to preserve their virtue. Ropes of onions plaited together, their papery skins whispering softly whenever a draught finds them. A dark, heavy cheese wrapped in cloth, aging into strength. Everything above him represents days of labour, weeks of foresight, months of quiet planning. Everything above him is the difference, quite literally, between whether his family will see another spring. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to a bed of glowing embers, tended with the same care one would give a sleeping child. In medieval homes, the fire was never allowed to fully die, not from any superstition, though there were plenty of those attached to the flame, but from pure practicality. Starting a fire from cold was a slow and difficult business involving flint and steel, or the patient friction of wood on wood, and a small nest of the driest tinder one could find. Maintaining a fire, on the other hand, was as simple as banking the embers carefully at night and coaxing them awake in the morning with a handful of dry straw and a few gentle breaths. And so, in every home in the village, a small ember glows even now in the deepest hour of the night, a tiny orange heart beating beneath a blanket of ash, waiting for dawn. The cottage smells of many things at once. Wood smoke, of course, which permeates everything, clothing, hair, skin, bedding, so completely that no one in the village ever notices it any longer. Beneath the smoke, there is the earthy smell of damp straw, both from the mattresses on which the family sleeps and from the fresh layer strewn across the packed earth floor. There is the warm animal scent of the family's milk cow, whose small byre shares a wall with the main living space, her body heat contributing a few precious degrees to the interior warmth. There is the faint, savoury memory of the pottage that Aldith cooked for the evening meal, still lingering in the black iron pot suspended over the coals. And beneath all of these, running like a subtle silver thread through the whole tapestry of scents, there is the sharp, clean smell of frost creeping in through every crack and seam of the ancient walls, patient and cold and waiting. Alwyn turns his head slowly on the rough pillow, careful not to disturb his wife. Aldith's breathing is deep and even, the sound of someone who has worked hard enough to earn her sleep. On the far side of the mattress, small Wulfric has curled himself into a tight ball, his face buried against his sister's shoulder. Hild, always the light sleeper, sighs softly and pulls the woolen blanket a little higher over both of them. Godric sleeps on his own narrow pallet against the wall, and even in sleep, his young man's frame seems to fill more space than it did just a season ago. Alwyn closes his eyes, but sleep does not come easily tonight. His mind moves quietly through the calculations that fill every medieval farmer's thoughts at this season. How much grain rests in the wooden chest by the door? How many pounds of salt pork hang overhead? How many pale wheels of cheese line the shelf? How much firewood is stacked along the northern wall of the cottage and covered with a weighted cloth against the coming snow? Whether it will be enough, whether it will stretch, whether when spring finally comes and the first green shoots push through the mud, his family will still be whole to see it. Outside, somewhere high in the black winter sky, the first faint flurries of the season's first true snow begin to fall. They drift down slowly at first, tentative and thin, small white ghosts moving on air so still that they seem to hesitate before touching the frozen earth. But by the time Alwyn finally slips into a restless sleep, the flurries have thickened into a steady, patient descent, and the world outside the cottage is beginning its slow transformation into a landscape of unbroken white. There is no sound of it, of course. Snow falls in silence. That was one of the strange gifts of medieval winter, this deep, otherworldly quiet that would settle over a village overnight, so complete that, when a person stepped outside in the morning, they might find themselves standing in a world so hushed that they could hear the beat of their own heart in their ears. Dawn arrives slowly on this November morning, hesitant and grey. Alwyn wakes before anyone else, as is his custom. He has been rising before dawn for so many years that his body no longer requires any prompting. He simply opens his eyes at the exact moment when the darkness beyond the wooden shutters has begun to soften, and he knows, without needing to see, that it is time to begin the day. He lies still for a long moment, listening. The wind has died down during the night. The cottage is deeply cold, colder than it was when they went to bed, and he can feel the sharp bite of the air on his cheeks and forehead, the only parts of him not tucked beneath the pile of woolen blankets and rough furs. He can hear the soft breathing of his family, the faint rustle of the cow shifting in her byre on the other side of the wall, and beyond that, the deep weighted silence that tells him the snow has come at last. He slips carefully from beneath the blankets, and the cold takes him at once. His breath rises in a pale cloud before his face. His feet, wrapped in thick woolen socks, meet the packed earth floor, and even through the wool he can feel the chill of it. He does not linger. He moves quickly to the hearth in the centre of the room, kneels beside it, and begins the most important ritual of any medieval winter morning: the reviving of the fire. There is a whole art to this that has been passed from father to son, mother to daughter, for uncounted generations. Alwyn reaches carefully into the bed of grey ash, and finds, with the certainty of long practice, the small clutch of embers he banked the night before. They are still there, small orange eyes glowing faintly beneath their blanket of ash, patient and waiting. He exposes them gently. From a small pile beside the hearth, he takes a handful of the driest straw, twists it into a loose ball, and lays it against the embers. He leans down and blows on it, slowly, steadily, with the patience of someone who has done this 10,000 times before. A thin curl of smoke rises. Then a whisper of flame. He adds a few slivers of pine, then thicker twigs, then a small piece of oak. Within a few minutes the fire is alive again, small but healthy, and the first true warmth of the day begins to spread into the cottage. Only then does he cross to the wooden shutters and open one of them a crack, and what he sees confirms everything he has already felt in his bones. The world outside has vanished. Where yesterday there was a garden plot, a low stone wall, a beaten path leading down toward the village centre, there is now only white. The snow has fallen for perhaps 6 or 7 hours, and it lies deep and unbroken across every surface, softening the sharp edges of fences and roof lines, piling in gentle drifts against the leeward side of every building. The sky above is the pale, colourless grey of new-forged pewter, and small flakes are still drifting down, though the heaviest fall seems to have passed. Alwyn stands there for a moment, watching, and something quiet and old moves through his chest. Not fear exactly. He has seen far too many winters for fear. But a kind of recognition. The season has begun in earnest now. There is no going back. Behind him, Aldith stirs. She sits up on the mattress, pulls a heavy woolen shawl around her shoulders, and joins him at the window. She says nothing for a long moment. She simply looks. Then she nods once, slowly, as if confirming something that had been suspected, but not yet proven. "It came in the night, then," she says quietly. "Aye," Alwyn replies, "heavy too, up past my knees in the drifts, I'd wager. The path to the well will need clearing. Godric will see to it after he's eaten." They stand there together for another moment, watching the last flakes drift down, and neither of them speaks. There is no need. They have shared enough winters between them that they can read the weather in each other's silences. This one, they can both tell, will be a hard one. The cold has come early, and it has come with weight, and if the pattern holds, they will be tested in the months to come. Aldith turns from the window and moves to wake the children. She does this with the gentleness of long habit, laying a hand first on Hild's shoulder, then on Wulfric's small back, murmuring their names softly. Godric she leaves for a moment longer, since he was up late the night before helping Alwyn split the last of the seasoned oak. When the 2 younger children begin to stir, blinking in the growing firelight and pulling their blankets closer against the cold, Aldith turns her attention to the morning meal. This will be a simple thing, as most medieval breakfasts were. A thick porridge of barley and oats, cooked over the hearth in the same black iron pot that served for every meal of the day. She fills it with water drawn from the covered pail by the door, adds a generous portion of grain from the wooden chest, and hangs it on the iron hook above the growing fire. While the porridge slowly begins its work, Aldith checks the other essential provisions that will see the family through the day. She lifts a wooden lid and peers into the salt barrel, where a portion of last week's slaughtered pork lies buried in coarse grey crystals, drawing out its moisture and preserving itself for the long months ahead. She counts the wheels of cheese on the high shelf where the mice cannot reach. She peers into the small clay jar of honey they were fortunate enough to gather from their single hive in late summer. She lifts a corner of the cloth that covers the wooden trough where dried peas and beans are stored. Everything is where it should be. Everything has been accounted for. And yet, even as she moves through this quiet inventory, she is already thinking ahead, already measuring, already asking herself how far each thing will stretch, and what will need to be rationed first, and what can be saved for the deepest weeks when hunger truly begins to press. By the time the porridge is ready, all 3 children are awake and gathered near the fire, still wrapped in their sleeping blankets, their bare feet tucked beneath them. Small Wulfric stares wide-eyed at the closed shutters, having caught only a glimpse of the transformed world outside before his mother pulled him back to the warmth of the hearth. Hild is already at work with her mother, cutting thin slices from yesterday's dark loaf and setting them out on wooden trenchers. Godric, roused at last, stretches his long arms above his head, yawns hugely, and pulls on his outer tunic. The family gathers close around the fire, sitting on low stools or on the packed earth floor itself, and Aldith serves each of them a portion of steaming porridge in wooden bowls, sweetened with the merest touch of honey for the children. They eat in near silence, as was the custom. Not from any lack of affection, but simply because food in the medieval world was too precious to be treated casually. Every spoonful was to be savoured. Every crust of bread was to be finished. Nothing was to be wasted. Alwyn murmurs a brief prayer of thanks before they begin, crossing himself in the old way, and each member of the family echoes the gesture. Then they eat, and the warmth of the porridge spreads slowly through their bodies, driving back the cold that had settled into their bones during the night. As they finish, Alwyn sets down his empty bowl and looks around at his family, and he begins to lay out the tasks of the day. There is much to be done. There is always much to be done. And though the snow has come, and the fields are hidden, and the outside world seems to have stopped, the truth of medieval winter was that the work never truly ceased. It only changed its shape. The list of tasks for a medieval winter morning was not written down. It never was. In a world where perhaps 1 person in 20 could read and write, and where paper and parchment were expensive luxuries reserved for scribes and clerics, all knowledge lived in memory and in habit. Alwyn did not need to consult any list. The tasks were written into the rhythm of his body, into the passage of the seasons, into the accumulated wisdom of every winter he had survived since he was a small boy at his own father's side. He spoke them aloud now to his family, not because they did not know, but because speaking them was a kind of ritual, a way of ordering the day, of setting each person on their path. "Godric," he said, turning first to his eldest, "the path to the well, first thing. Then the byre wants mucking, and the cow will need her water. The pond will be frozen over by now, so you'll have to break the ice for her drinking. Mind you don't fall in." Godric nodded, already reaching for the heavy leather boots that stood by the door. "Hild," Alwyn continued, turning to his daughter, "help your mother with the spinning today. And there's mending to be done on my second tunic." The elbow's gone through again. Hild inclined her head in her quiet way. She was already known in the village for her steady, patient hands with a needle, a skill that would serve her well in the years to come when she took a husband of her own. Wulfric. Alwyn's voice softened as he looked at his youngest, who was still sitting cross-legged on the earth floor, spooning the last of his porridge into his mouth with great concentration. "You'll help your mother today. Gather the eggs from the hens, if there are any, and mind you check every corner. They hide them when it's cold, and keep the fire fed with the small wood, but don't put on the big pieces. That's my job, or your brother's. Do you understand?" Wulfric nodded solemnly, taking the responsibility with all the seriousness a 7-year-old could summon. In the medieval world, even the youngest children had their tasks. There was no such thing as a childhood free from work. It was not cruelty. It was simply necessity. A family with 5 hands to work could survive where a family with only 2 would perish, and every child in the village learned from the moment they could walk that their small contributions mattered. Alwyn himself would be busy elsewhere. He was going to spend the morning with 2 of the other men of the village, working on the wooden fence that surrounded the churchyard sheep pen. It had sagged badly during the autumn storms, and if it collapsed under the weight of the snow, the small flock of sheep that belonged to the church, and to whichever families held shares in them, would be exposed to whatever wolves or wild dogs still roamed the hills. It was cold, hard work, and Alwyn was not looking forward to it. But it was the kind of work that could not be put off, and it was the kind of work that bound the village together. His labour today would be remembered when his own barn needed mending in the spring. After the family had finished their meal and each had taken up their tasks, Aldith rose and began the slower, more patient work that would occupy much of her winter. She moved to the corner of the cottage where her spinning wheel stood, and though we call it a wheel, in truth it was a simple thing, a distaff and a spindle, a device so old that its origins were lost in the deep centuries before Rome. Aldith took a handful of carded wool from a basket by her feet, teased out a few fibres, and began the slow hypnotic motion of drawing and twisting that would turn raw fleece into the yarn that clothed her family. She had been doing this since she was 6 years old. Her hands moved without thought. Her mind was free to wander. And wander it did. Aldith thought, as she spun, about the year ahead. She thought about the winter still to come, and the spring beyond it. She thought about her daughter Hild, who was 12 now, and who would be considered old enough for marriage within only a few short years. She thought about young Wulfric, who was small for his age and who had always been the most vulnerable of her 3 children to the coughing sicknesses that stalked the village every winter. She thought about her husband, whose knees had been paining him more and more each cold season, and about her eldest son Godric, whose shoulders were broadening into manhood so quickly that she sometimes did not recognise him from across the room. She thought about all of them, and as she thought, her hands kept up their steady, ancient work, and the yarn grew slowly on the spindle, one soft rotation at a time. Outside, meanwhile, Godric had emerged into the transformed world for the first time. The cold hit him at once, sharp and clean, driving straight through his heavy woolen tunic and the 2 undertunics he wore beneath it. He had wrapped his lower legs in strips of thick cloth, bound in a crisscrossing pattern from ankle to knee, and this was the medieval solution to the problem of trousers in cold weather. Leg wrappings, called winningas by his ancestors, provided both warmth and protection, and they could be adjusted for tightness depending on the depth of the snow or the difficulty of the terrain. On his head he wore a hood of coarse brown wool that came down past his shoulders and framed his young face against the biting wind. On his hands he wore mittens knitted from undyed wool, and though his fingers were cold within them, they were not yet numb. The snow came up past his knees in some places. In others, where the wind had scoured it thin, it barely reached his ankles. He waded through it toward the small wooden shed where the family's tools were kept, and from there he took a wooden shovel with a broad, flat blade. The blade was reinforced along its edge with a thin strip of iron, a precious thing that had cost his father dearly, and it was used carefully and treated with respect. Iron was not a material that peasants took for granted. Every nail, every hinge, every blade in the village had been forged by the local smith or brought in by travelling merchants, and each represented real labour and real cost. He began at the door of the cottage and worked outward, clearing a narrow path just wide enough for a person to walk. He did not attempt to clear the whole yard. That would have been foolish. The point of a winter path was not to remove the snow entirely, but to create a passable route between the essential points of daily life, from the cottage door to the byre where the cow lived, from the cottage door to the wood pile against the northern wall, from the cottage door to the small privy behind the hedge, and most importantly, from the cottage door to the village well. The well was perhaps 100 paces down the beaten track that led toward the centre of the village. In summer, this was a pleasant walk of no more than a minute, taking a person past the small vegetable gardens of the neighbouring cottages and beneath the branches of an old spreading oak that stood at a bend in the path. In winter, that same journey could take a quarter of an hour, and it could be dangerous if the snow was deep or the ice underneath was slick. Falling and breaking a bone in the medieval world was often a death sentence, not from the injury itself, but from what it meant for a family's ability to survive. A woman who could not spin could not clothe her family. A man who could not walk could not gather wood. A child who could not run and fetch could not contribute to the household. And so, even in the deepest cold, people walked with care. They tested each step. They watched the ground before them. Injury was to be avoided at all costs. As Godric worked his way down the path with his shovel, other villagers were emerging from their own cottages and beginning the same slow labour. Old Wilfred, the wheelwright, who lived 3 cottages down, raised a mittened hand in greeting. His son Seniorwulf, who was a year younger than Godric, appeared behind him with a shovel of his own. They exchanged the customary greetings of a winter morning, brief and warm, and then they set to work. Sometimes clearing toward one another, sometimes each toward his own destination, always aware of the others working nearby. This was the medieval village in miniature. Independent households, each responsible for its own survival, but bound together by 1,000 small threads of cooperation and mutual assistance that made the whole thing possible. By the time Godric reached the well, his breath was coming hard, and his shoulders were beginning to burn from the effort of the shovelling. The well itself was a simple structure, a circular wall of fieldstones rising about waist-high, capped with a small wooden roof to keep out debris, with a wooden bucket suspended by a rope over a hand-cranked winch. He brushed the snow off the wooden roof, cleared the immediate area around the wellhead, and then lowered the bucket. The rope creaked. Down and down it went into the deep dark shaft, and he could hear the faint hollow splash as it struck the water far below. He cranked the winch, hauling the full bucket back up, and when it emerged, it steamed gently in the cold air. Well water in winter was always warmer than the outside temperature, though never truly warm, and this small kindness of the earth was one of the quiet blessings that made survival possible. He drank a small mouthful directly from the bucket, wiped his lips with the back of his mittened hand, and began the careful walk back toward the cottage. The full bucket was heavy. He carried it in one hand and kept his shovel in the other, and he walked with a slow, deliberate step, watching where his feet came down, mindful always of the ice hidden beneath the snow. Halfway home, he passed the widow Quenber, an old woman of perhaps 60 years, though it was difficult to tell exactly, since medieval faces aged quickly. She was hobbling along her own newly cleared path with a much smaller bucket, and she smiled at him from beneath her heavy woolen hood. "A hard morning, young Godric," she called. "Aye, Mother Quenber," he replied, using the honorific by which all elderly women in the village were addressed. "But the fire's warm, and there's porridge to be had." "Bless you, boy," she said, and continued on her slow way. He watched her go, and something quiet turned over in his chest. His mother had told him that Quenber's husband had died 2 winters past, and that her only son had gone off to seek work in the town of York the summer before, and that no word had come back from him since. She lived alone now, and though the village looked after her as best it could, she would be one of the ones they watched most carefully in the months to come. Godric returned to the cottage with the water and set the bucket carefully by the door, where a small wooden lid could be laid over it to keep the surface from freezing in the cold air that seeped constantly through every crack and seam. His mother nodded to him from her spinning without breaking her rhythm, and Hild rose from her mending to help him unwrap the leg bindings that were now caked with snow. He shook them out over the hearth, careful not to let too much moisture reach the fire, and hung them from a wooden peg set into the wall to dry. He would need them again within the hour. There was still the matter of the cow. Her name was Elfgifu, which meant elf-gift, a name Aldith had given her when she was a young heifer, and she was perhaps the single most valuable possession the Ashcombe family owned. A milk cow in a medieval peasant household was not merely livestock. She was food, she was wealth, she was insurance against disaster, and she was, in her own quiet bovine way, almost a member of the family. Her milk in the summer months provided butter and cheese that could be stored for winter. Her calves, if she bore any, could be sold or traded at market for coin or goods. Her hide, when her time eventually came, would make leather. Her horns would become handles and vessels. Her bones would flavour soups for weeks. Every part of her would be used, and every day she survived was another day the family's fortunes held. Godric wrapped himself against the cold once more, and stepped outside, this time moving around to the small byre that shared a wall with the cottage. The byre was a low structure with a thatched roof, its walls made of the same wattle and daub as the cottage itself, and inside it was surprisingly warm. Aelfgifu had spent the night pressed against the shared wall, and her body heat, combined with the heat that seeped through from the cottage hearth, had kept the small space above freezing. She turned her great dark eyes on him as he entered, and let out a low, contented sound that was somewhere between a lowing and a sigh. "Good morning, old girl," Godric said, and he laid a hand on her broad flank. She was warm beneath his palm, and he could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of her breathing. He set about his tasks with practised ease. First he cleared the byre of the night's droppings, shovelling them into a wooden bucket that would later be added to the manure pile behind the cottage. Nothing in the medieval world was wasted, and cow dung was too valuable to be treated as mere refuse. It would be spread on the fields in the spring as fertilizer, or when properly dried and mixed with straw. It could even be used as fuel in regions where firewood was scarce. Next, he laid down fresh straw for her bedding. The straw itself came from the family's own harvest, threshed in the autumn, and stored in the loft above the byre. He forked down enough to give her a soft, dry place to rest, and Eilfgifu lowered her great head and nosed at it approvingly. Then, he refilled her water trough with a portion of the water he had just brought from the well, being careful not to spill. Finally, he brought her food. This was hay, dried grass cut and cured in the long days of high summer, and it was the single most important resource in a medieval peasant's winter calculations, save only for the family's own grain. Every farmer in every village across medieval Europe faced the same essential problem when it came to livestock. How do you keep an animal alive through the 4 or 5 months of winter when there is no grass to graze? The answer was hay, cut in June and July when the meadows were at their peak, dried in the sun, and stored in barns and lofts against the coming cold. But hay was bulky, and it required an enormous amount of labour to produce, and most peasant families could only cut and store enough to keep their most essential animals alive. This was why St. Martin's Day was so important. This was why the pigs and the extra sheep and the older chickens had been slaughtered in November. There was simply not enough hay to keep them all alive. Only the breeding animals, the working animals, and the milk animals were kept through the winter, and even these were fed sparingly, given just enough to survive and no more. Eilfgifu bent her head to the hay and began to eat, slowly and methodically, in the patient way of cattle. Godric watched her for a moment, running his hand along her broad back, checking her condition. She was thinner than she had been at Michaelmas, which was normal for this time of year. Winter was hard on cattle as it was hard on humans, and by spring, when the first green grass finally pushed through the mud, she would be gaunt and weak and desperately hungry. But if the family could keep her alive until then, she would recover quickly, and by early summer she would once again be giving the rich milk that had earned her name. By the time Godric returned to the cottage, his father had already left for the churchyard, joining the other men of the village at the sagging sheep pen fence. Alwyn had wrapped himself in his heaviest cloak, a garment of coarse brown wool that reached to his knees and was fastened at the shoulder with a bronze pin. He carried a bag of tools slung over his back, an axe, a mallet, an awl, a coil of leather cord, and he walked with the slightly stooped posture that came from years of working close to the earth. The other men would already be gathering. Sinewulf's father Wilfrid the wheelwright, John Miller, whose great mill wheel now stood silent and frozen, Osric the shepherd, who tended the sheep in question. Old Father Aelfric, the village priest, would come out as well, less to work than to bless the labour and to keep the men company. There was a particular quality to men's work in the medieval village that would be difficult to describe to a modern audience. It was slow, it was steady, and it was accompanied by an almost constant flow of low conversation. The men did not rush. Rushing was a luxury of the young and the foolish. They worked at a pace that could be sustained for hours, and as they worked, they talked. They talked about the weather, they talked about the state of the harvest just past, and the prospects for the harvest to come. They talked about their neighbours, sometimes kindly and sometimes not. They talked about news from other villagers, which arrived rarely and was treated as precious. They talked about their families, their children, their aches and pains. They told the same stories they had told 100 times before, and they laughed at the same jokes, and the work went on beneath the conversation like a river running beneath the ice. At the churchyard, Alwyn found the others already assembled. Father Aelfric had built a small fire in a stone-ringed pit near the fence, and the men were gathered around it, warming their hands before the work began. There was a shared clay jug of small ale, weak but warming, and each man took a swallow when it came to him. Small ale in medieval England was not the strong drink of modern imagination. It was a low-alcohol beverage brewed from the second running of the mash, safer to drink than water, nutritious in its own modest way, and consumed by everyone from the youngest child to the oldest grandmother. A working man might drink several quarts of small ale in the course of a day and think nothing of it. "Alwyn," said John Miller, raising the jug in greeting. "How's your boy Godric coming along? Old enough to think about a wife yet?" Alwyn took the jug and drank a slow swallow before answering. "He's 16, John. Give him time. He's not you, chasing after every skirt in the parish before he had a beard." The men laughed, and John Miller shrugged good-naturedly. A man ought to marry young. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Waiting only makes it harder. Or easier, Wilfrid the wheelwright put in dryly. Depending on the woman. More laughter. Father Elfric, an old man of nearly 60 years, with a face like weathered oak and hands gnarled from decades of both prayer and manual labour, smiled quietly and said nothing. He had heard this conversation, or one very like it, every winter for 40 years. He would hear it again next winter, and the winter after that, until at last he was in the churchyard for a different reason. In the medieval village, the great cycles of human life turned slowly, and the same conversations recurred as reliably as the seasons themselves. They set to work on the fence. The problem was that several of the vertical stakes had rotted at the base, weakened by years of standing in wet soil, and the horizontal rails had begun to sag under their own weight. If nothing was done, the whole structure would collapse under the weight of the snow that was sure to come in the deep months of January and February. The solution was straightforward, but laborious. They would drive new stakes into the frozen ground alongside the old ones, using heavy mallets and iron-tipped posts, and then they would lash the new stakes to the horizontal rails to reinforce them. Driving stakes into frozen ground was miserable work. The earth was hard as stone. Every blow of the mallet sent a jolt of pain up the arm of the man swinging it. The men took turns, working in short bursts, then stepping back to warm their hands over the fire while another took his turn. Progress was slow. In an hour, they managed to drive perhaps 4 stakes. But no one complained. Complaining was not in the character of these men. They simply worked, and they talked, and they passed the jug of small ale, and gradually, one blow at a time. The fence grew stronger. Alwyn's hands ached, his shoulders burned. His breath came in great white clouds that hung in the cold air before dispersing. But there was, beneath the physical discomfort, a deep and quiet satisfaction. This was the work that held the world together. This was the labour by which a village continued to exist. And though no one would ever remember his name, and no chronicle would ever record that Alwyn Ashcombe had helped to repair the churchyard fence in the year 1348, he was, in his own small and essential way, doing his part to keep the great slow wheel of medieval life turning. By midday, the men at the fence had made enough progress to feel that the work would hold, at least until the deep freeze of January made further repairs impossible. They gathered around the small fire for one last time, passed the jug of small ale between them, and spoke of returning in a few days to complete what remained. Alwyn bid his companions farewell, shouldered his tool-bag, and began the slow walk back toward his cottage. The sky had cleared somewhat since morning, and pale winter sunlight now slanted across the snow-covered village at a low, wintry angle. It gave no warmth, this light. It only gilded the tops of the drifts with a thin gold sheen, and cast long blue shadows behind every wall and tree. Alwyn walked slowly, partly from weariness and partly from habit. He passed the small stone church, its bell tower dark against the pale sky. He passed the mill, silent now, its great wheel frozen in place, icicles hanging from the underside of its wooden housing. He passed the manor house on its low rise, where a thin thread of smoke rose from a stone chimney, evidence that the lord's family was in residence for the winter. Most lords with holdings across several villages did not remain in any single manor through the whole cold season, but instead moved between their estates according to some schedule of feasts and obligations. But the lord of this village, one Sir Edmund by name, was a modest knight with only 2 holdings, and he tended to remain in the larger manor here rather than travel through the snow to his smaller property in the next valley. The manor house was a different world from the peasant cottages that surrounded it. It was built of stone rather than wattle and daub, and it stood 2 stories tall. It had a proper hall with a raised dais at one end, where the lord and his family took their meals, and a great hearth against one wall large enough to burn whole logs. It had glazed windows, small squares of imperfect green-tinted glass held together in lead frames that admitted light while keeping out the wind. It had multiple rooms, including a private solar for the lord and his lady, a chamber where important guests could be lodged, and quarters for the household servants. It had tapestries on the walls, brought in from Flanders at great cost, that added both decoration and insulation. It had feather beds instead of straw mattresses. It had wax candles instead of rushlights. It had wine in barrels rather than small ale in clay jugs. And yet, for all its comforts, the manor house was in some ways colder than the peasant cottages. Stone conducted heat away from any surface it touched. The great hall, though heated by an enormous hearth, was so large that its far corners remained bitterly cold throughout the winter. Ice sometimes formed in the wash basins of the upper chambers overnight. The lord and his family wrapped themselves in furs at their meals, and the servants who waited upon them worked in a kind of dance of quick service and hasty retreat toward the warmer parts of the house. Wealth in the medieval world bought many things, but it did not fully buy escape from the cold. Winter was the great equalizer, and even the lord in his stone hall shivered on the deepest nights. Alwyn, however, was thinking of none of these things as he passed the manor. He was thinking of the warmth of his own hearth, of the pottage that his wife would have simmering by now, and of the possibility that there might be a bit of that precious salt pork to flavour the meal. He quickened his pace as best he could through the snow, and by the time he reached his own cottage door, his stomach was reminding him loudly that he had eaten nothing since dawn. The cottage, when he entered, was a small and blessed world of warmth and light. The fire in the central hearth was burning steadily, fed by the small pieces of wood that Wulfric had been carefully adding through the morning. The great black pot hung above the flames, and from it rose a rich, earthy smell of vegetables and grain, and the faintest hint of meat. Aldith sat by her spinning, and her spindle continued to turn even as she looked up to greet him. Hild was still at her mending, though she had moved closer to the fire now that the light outside had begun to fade. Wulfric was sitting cross-legged on the earth floor, playing quietly with a set of small wooden animals that his father had carved for him 2 winters past. Godric had gone out again, this time to check the rabbit snares he had set the previous day in the hedgerows at the edge of the field. Alwyn stripped off his cloak, unwound his leg bindings, and set his heavy boots by the door to dry. He crossed to the hearth and held his hands out to the flames, and the heat came into them slowly, as if from far away. His fingers ached as the blood returned to them. His cheeks burned where they had been cold. He stood there for a long moment, simply feeling the fire, feeling the warmth work its way into his bones. Then he turned to his wife. "John Miller says his brother-in-law in the next parish has lost 2 sheep to wolves," he said. Aldith's spindle paused for a moment, then resumed its steady turning. 2? So early in the winter? Aye, he says they came down from the high country a fortnight past. Osric's going to bring our village sheep in closer to the manor at nights, out of the open fold. Wise of him. There's talk of putting together a hunt if the wolves come nearer. Sir Edmund would allow it, John says. Aldith made a small sound of acknowledgment, but did not look up from her work. Wolves were a fact of medieval winter life, particularly in the northern counties. In summer they kept to the deep forests and the high moors, feeding on deer and hares and whatever wild game they could find, and they rarely troubled human settlements. But winter changed everything. Winter drove the game into deeper cover, made hunting difficult, and forced the wolves down out of their remote strongholds in search of easier prey. Sheep were the favourite targets. A wolf could take a sheep with a single quick bite to the throat, and a pack of wolves could destroy an entire flock in one bad night. Every winter, throughout medieval Europe, wolves killed livestock and, more rarely they killed people. a traveller alone on a forest road after dark, a shepherd who had wandered too far from the village, a drunk man returning home from a wedding feast in the next parish. These were the ones who occasionally did not return, and their disappearances entered the long dark folklore of medieval winter. Aldith set aside her spinning and rose to serve the midday meal. Medieval peasants ate twice a day for most of the year, a lighter meal in the morning and the main meal in the afternoon, though in winter, when the days were short and physical activity was reduced, some families dropped even the morning porridge and ate only once, at midday. The Ashcombe today would eat their main meal now, in the early afternoon, taking advantage of the pale winter light while it lasted. The meal was pottage. Pottage was the great daily food of medieval Europe, so universal that it would be impossible to overstate its importance. It was, at its simplest, a thick soup or stew of whatever ingredients a family had available, cooked slowly over the hearth for hours, sometimes for days, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. In the poorer households, pottage might be little more than grain and water flavoured with an onion or a few herbs. In wealthier households it might contain meat, several kinds of vegetables, and expensive spices. In every household, it was the reliable, adaptable, endless meal that could stretch to feed however many mouths sat down at the fire. Today's pottage was better than most that the Ashcombes would eat this winter. Aldith had added a small piece of salt pork, cut from one of the hams hanging in the rafters, and its flavour had spread through the whole pot. There was barley, thick and satisfying. There were dried peas, softened by long simmering. There were turnips and parsnips from the storage pit outside, cut into small pieces. There was an onion, chopped fine. There was a pinch of dried sage from the summer garden. All of it had come together into a rich, brown, savoury stew that filled the wooden bowls with steam when she ladled it out. She served her husband first, then the children, then herself last, as was the custom. Each of them received a portion appropriate to their size and their day's labour. Alwyn, who had spent the morning driving stakes into frozen ground, received the largest bowl. Godric, when he returned, would receive nearly as much. Hild and Aldith received smaller portions. Little Wulfric received the smallest of all, though his mother made sure his bowl contained a fair share of the salt pork, since growing children needed the strength that meat provided. They ate with wooden spoons from wooden bowls, and they ate slowly, and they ate in near silence. Alwyn tore pieces from a small loaf of dark bread and used them to sop up the last of the pottage from his bowl. Bread and pottage together were the medieval peasants' dinner across all of northern Europe, from Cornwall to the Ural Mountains, with only small local variations. The Italian peasant ate something similar, though with more vegetables and less meat. The German peasant ate something similar, though with more sauerkraut and rye bread. The Russian peasant ate something similar, though with cabbage and kasha replacing turnips and barley. Across a continent and across 1,000 years, the humble bowl of pottage sustained the working people of Europe. Just as they were finishing, the door opened, and Godric ducked in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots and shaking flakes from his hood. His cheeks were red with the wind, and his eyes were bright, and in his hand he held 2 small brown shapes that Aldith recognised at once. Rabbits, 2 of them, both fat and healthy, taken cleanly by the snares he had set in the hedgerow. "A good day," Alwyn said quietly, and Aldith smiled, and even young Wulfric's eyes lit up at the sight, for fresh meat in winter was a rare and precious thing indeed. Godric laid the 2 rabbits on the small wooden table by the door, and began, with practised ease, the work of preparing them. This was a task he had done many times, taught first by his father, and then refined through his own experience, and he moved through the steps with the calm efficiency of someone who has long since ceased to think about what his hands are doing. He began by hanging each rabbit from a wooden peg by its hind legs, and then, with a small sharp knife, he made careful incisions and removed the skins in nearly whole pieces. The skins were valuable. Rabbit fur was not the warmest of pelts, but it was soft and light, and a good number of rabbit skins sewn together could make a lining for a cloak, or a cap for a child, or a pair of mittens for winter work. Aldith would clean and stretch and cure them in the days to come, and by spring she might have enough to trim a garment for young Wulfric, who was growing so fast that his current clothes were already becoming too small. Once the skins were removed, Godric emptied the animals of their entrails, saving what was useful and setting aside what was not. The liver, the kidneys, and the heart of each rabbit went into a small wooden bowl. These would go into tonight's pottage, adding richness and iron and the vital, dense nutrition that medieval bodies craved in the cold months. The intestines, if they had been from larger animals like pigs, would have been cleaned and used as sausage casings, but rabbit intestines were too small for such purposes, and so these went into a separate bucket that would later be given to the pig belonging to their neighbour Wilfrid, who kept a single sow through the winter. Nothing was wasted. Even the small skulls and the tiny leg bones would be boiled long after the meat was gone, extracting every last bit of marrow and mineral into a thin broth that would flavour the next day's meal. The rabbit meat itself, still warm from the animals' lives, was cut into pieces and set aside. 2 rabbits would not feed the family for long, perhaps for a single generous meal or 2 more modest ones, but their contribution was more than merely caloric. Fresh meat in the depths of winter was a psychological gift as much as a physical one. The monotony of preserved foods, the endless pottage, the dark bread, the salt-heavy pork, the aged cheese, all of these could wear on a family's spirits over the long months. A meal of fresh rabbit, properly seasoned and slowly stewed, was a small celebration. It was a reminder that the world outside still contained life, that the fields and hedgerows still held creatures that had not been dried or salted or smoked into preservation. It was, in its own small way, hope. While Godric finished his work, Alwyn settled himself on a low stool by the hearth and took up a piece of wood he had been slowly shaping over the past few evenings. It was a length of ash, the wood that the medieval English used above all others for tool handles because of its strength and its slight, forgiving flexibility. He was making a new handle for his hoe, which he would need in the spring for the first turning of the garden soil. The old handle had cracked during the last summer's work, and he had been meaning to replace it ever since. Winter evenings, when there was little else to do, were the time for such patient labour. He worked with a small draw-knife, drawing the blade toward himself along the length of the wood, taking off a thin curl of shavings with each stroke. The shavings fell to the earth floor at his feet, and later they would be swept up and added to the tinder pile beside the hearth, where they would eventually help revive the fire on some future cold morning. Nothing was wasted. Alwyn's hands moved slowly and steadily, and his mind wandered as he worked. He thought about the coming spring, about the fields that would need to be ploughed, about the seeds that had been saved from the last year's harvest, and now waited in clay jars for the earth to warm. He thought about which fields would be planted with which crops. He thought about the great 3-field system that governed the agriculture of his village, in which one field was planted with a winter crop like rye or wheat, one field with a spring crop like barley or oats or peas, and one field left fallow to rest and recover, its soil replenished by the manure of grazing animals. The rotation was ancient. It had been used in his grandfather's time, and his grandfather's grandfather's time, and it would be used, though he could not know it, for centuries yet to come, until the great agricultural revolutions of a much later age would finally replace it. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fail. In medieval England in November and December, the sun set by mid-afternoon, and full darkness came shortly thereafter. This was one of the great difficulties of medieval winter that modern people can barely imagine. The days were terribly short. There were perhaps 7 or 8 hours between sunrise and sunset in the deepest weeks of winter, and only a portion of those hours were bright enough for outdoor work. The rest of the 24-hour cycle was darkness. Long, black, unbroken darkness, in which the only light was the flicker of a hearth fire or the small dim flame of a rushlight. Rushlights were the peasant equivalent of candles, and they were the humble illumination of every cottage in the village. To make one, a woman would gather rushes from the marshy places by the stream in summer, peel away the outer skin of each rush to expose the pithy interior, and then soak the pith repeatedly in melted animal fat until it was thoroughly saturated. When lit, a rushlight burned with a small, smoky, flickering flame that gave off perhaps as much light as a modern birthday candle. It was not much. It was barely enough to see one's hands by, but it was better than nothing, and a single rushlight, propped in a small iron holder, could provide enough illumination for a family to eat their evening meal, mend a torn garment, or tell a story around the fire. Wax candles, by contrast, were an expensive luxury reserved for the church, the manor house, and the wealthiest merchants. A single beeswax candle could cost more than a peasant family earned in a week of labour, and so beeswax candles were burned only on important religious feast days or during ceremonies. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were more affordable but still not cheap, and they burned with a smoky, greasy flame that smelled unpleasantly of the fat from which they had been made. Most peasant families had a few tallow candles saved for special occasions, but for the ordinary dark hours of winter evenings they relied on the humble rushlight and, above all, on the light of the hearth fire itself. Aldith rose from her spinning as the light began to dim, and began to prepare the evening meal. This would be a modest thing compared to the midday pottage, since the family had already eaten their main meal, but it was still worth preparing carefully. She took a portion of the rabbit meat that Godric had prepared and cut it into small pieces. She added these to a small pot along with water, a few pieces of dried carrot from the storage pit, a pinch of salt, and a scattering of dried thyme. She hung the pot over the fire on a smaller iron hook lower down than the great pot, closer to the flames, and left it to simmer slowly. By the time the family was ready to eat, in perhaps 2 hours, the rabbit would be tender and the broth would be rich with flavour. While the meat simmered, she and Hild set about the daily work of tending to the family's clothes. Winter was hard on garments. The constant cold, the damp, the smoke, the physical labour, all of these took their toll, and clothing that had been made carefully in the summer or received as a hand-me-down could easily fall apart if not maintained. Hild had been mending her father's tunic all afternoon, patiently closing the hole in the elbow with small, careful stitches. Now Aldith took up her son Wulfric's small woolen hose, which had developed a thin place at the knee, and began to darn them with a needle threaded with dark brown wool. Darning was a skill every medieval woman learned as a girl, and it was one of the great quiet arts of survival. A pair of hose or a tunic that could be mended over and over again could last a decade or more. A garment that fell apart because no one could repair it was a disaster. New clothing was expensive, both in the raw materials, wool from the sheep, linen from the flax, leather from the cattle, and in the enormous labour required to turn those raw materials into finished garments. Every step, from shearing to carding to spinning to weaving to cutting to sewing, was done by hand, and each step took time. A single simple woolen tunic represented weeks or months of work, from the moment the sheep was sheared to the moment the finished garment was pulled over its wearer's head. And so, when a garment tore or wore thin, mending it was not merely economical, it was essential. The mother and daughter worked side by side in the growing dimness of the cottage, the fire casting orange light across their faces and their busy hands, and neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. They had done this work together countless times before, and they moved in a kind of silent partnership that only comes from long years of shared labour. Occasionally Aldith would murmur a small correction to Hild's stitching, or Hild would ask a quiet question about a difficult section of the mend. Otherwise, they simply worked. The fire crackled. The small pot of rabbit stew bubbled gently over the flames. Wulfric played on the earth floor with his wooden animals, making them walk in slow circles around the hearth. Alwyn continued to shape the ash handle at his stool. Godric, his rabbit work finished, and the skins hung to cure on the wall, sat cross-legged near the fire and began to sharpen a small knife with a whetstone, the soft rhythmic scraping of the stone joining the other quiet sounds of the cottage. Outside, the light continued to fade. Somewhere in the distance, a dog began to bark, then stopped. A wind was rising again, and it moved through the bare branches of the trees with a low, mournful sound. Full darkness came to the village earlier than it had come the day before, as it always did in these deepening weeks of the year. By the time the family gathered around the hearth for their evening meal, the world outside the cottage had disappeared entirely. There were no street lamps, no distant windows glowing with electric light, no faint glow on the horizon from a nearby town. There was only the deep, unbroken blackness of a medieval night, and against it, the small orange glow of the Ashcombs fire seemed to be the only light in the whole of creation. Aldith served the rabbit stew into wooden bowls, and its rich, savoury smell filled the small space, and seemed to draw the family closer to the fire, closer to each other, closer to the small warm heart of their world. They ate more slowly this time than they had at midday. There was no urgency now. The day's work was done, and the evening stretched before them with no obligations except those they chose. This was one of the strange gifts of medieval winter, this compression of activity into the daylight hours, followed by the long, slow expansion of the evening into a kind of enforced leisure. In summer, when a farmer might work from before dawn until after dusk, there was little time for rest, for reflection, for storytelling, for the simple pleasures of family life. But in winter, when darkness came before the 5th hour after noon, and did not lift again until well past the 9th hour of the morning, there were long stretches of time that had to be filled somehow. And the medieval peasant, with no books to read, no music to play unless he made it himself, no entertainment except what could be conjured from imagination and memory, filled those hours with the ancient arts of talking and telling and singing and simply being together. After the meal, when the wooden bowls had been wiped clean with the last crusts of bread and stacked by the door, the family settled into their evening places around the hearth. Alwyn took his low stool near the fire, where the light was best for his continued work on the ash-handle. Aldith sat on a slightly higher stool with her spinning, though she had exchanged the day's work of drawing yarn for the finer, slower work of plying 2 threads together into a stronger cord. Held curled on a folded blanket at her mother's feet, her mending set aside for the moment, her hands empty in her lap. Wulfric had abandoned his wooden animals and now sat pressed against his father's leg, staring into the flames with the total absorption that only a small child can bring to the simple act of watching fire. Godric sat cross-legged on the earth floor, his back against one of the wooden support posts of the cottage, his sharpened knife now returned to its leather sheath at his belt. For a long while no one spoke. The fire crackled quietly. The wind, which had been rising through the afternoon, now moaned steadily against the thatched roof, and occasionally a stronger gust would send a small shower of dust and old smoke down from the rafters. Aelfgifu the cow could be heard shifting in her byre through the shared wall. Somewhere out in the deep darkness of the village, a small bell rang faintly, perhaps from the church, marking one of the canonical hours by which the medieval day was ordered. Compline, perhaps, the hour of the final prayer of the day, when the monks in their distant monasteries would be singing the last psalms before retiring to their cells. Father Aelfric would be at his prayers now in the small stone church, alone in the cold, his breath rising in clouds before the flickering candle on the altar. It was Wulfric who broke the silence, as small children so often did. He tilted his head back to look up at his father, and in the small serious voice of a child asking a question he had been thinking about for some time, he said, "Father, will the wolves come here?" Alwyn's hands stilled on the draw-knife. He looked down at his youngest son, and something in the boy's grave upturned face made him set the wood aside entirely. This was not a question to be answered while working. This was a question that deserved his full attention. "No, little one," he said, and he laid a broad calloused hand on the top of Wulfric's head. "The wolves will not come here. Our village is too big, and there are too many dogs, and too many fires. Wolves fear the fires most of all. They will not come near a place where the fires burn." Wulfric considered this for a long moment. But John Miller said his brother-in-law lost 2 sheep. Alwyn exchanged a glance with Aldith across the hearth. Little Wulfric had been listening more closely than they had realised. Medieval children spent so much time in the constant company of adults that they absorbed everything, understood everything, and often knew far more about the harsh realities of the world than their parents would have chosen for them. Yes, Alwyn said, and he did not lie to the boy. Because lying to children was not the medieval way. Children had to know the truth of the world. Their lives depended on knowing it. Yes, some sheep were lost. But those sheep were in the open fold of the next parish, and no one was watching them. Our sheep are being brought in close to the manor every night now, and Osric is watching them with his 2 dogs. The wolves will not get our sheep, and they will not eat me. Alwyn's face softened, and he drew his small son closer against his side. No, my heart, they will not eat you. You are safe here. The fire is watching. Your mother is watching. Your brother and sister are watching. I am watching. Nothing will come near you. Wulfric leaned into his father's warmth and said no more, but his small hand found Alwyn's larger one and held it tightly. Aldith watched them across the fire, and something moved in her chest that she did not name. She had lost 2 children before Godric had been born, both in their first year of life, one to a fever and one to a wasting sickness that had never been explained. She had lost one more between Hild and Wulfric, a small daughter who had lived only 3 days. Every mother in the village had similar losses. It was the great sorrow that lay beneath every medieval household, the constant nearness of death, particularly the death of children. Perhaps 1/3 of all children born did not live to see their 5th year. Perhaps half did not live to reach adulthood. Aldith had been fortunate. 3 of her children had survived to sit here around this fire tonight. 3 of her children were warm and fed and safe. She was not so foolish as to imagine that this good fortune would last forever, but she was wise enough to be grateful for it in this present moment, and she watched them now with a quiet, fierce love that she did not need to speak aloud. Hild, sensing the mood had grown heavy, spoke up in her quiet voice. "Mother, will you sing?" Aldith smiled. Her voice was not remarkable, but it was true and clear, and she knew many of the old songs that had been passed down through the women of her family for generations. Some were church songs, taught to her by her own mother, who had learnt them by listening at the door of the parish church on feast days. Some were work songs, sung to the rhythm of grinding grain or turning butter. Some were older still, songs that had been sung by her ancestors before the coming of Christianity to England, songs whose words had grown strange, and whose meanings had been half forgotten, but whose melodies persisted, carried across the centuries by the voices of mothers singing to their children in the long dark evenings of countless medieval winters. She began to sing now, softly, so as not to strain her voice. It was a song about a maiden who walked in a green wood on a summer's day and met a stranger there, and though the story of the song was one of loss, its melody was gentle and soothing, rising and falling in slow, patient phrases that seemed to match the crackling of the fire and the moaning of the wind outside. Hild joined in on the refrain, her young voice thin but true, and after a few moments even Godric hummed along beneath his breath. Wulfric did not sing, but he listened with wide eyes, and gradually his small body relaxed against his father's side. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long moment. The last note seemed to hang in the smoky air of the cottage, joining all the other songs that had been sung in this same room over the many years since it had first been built. Then Alwyn cleared his throat and said, "Tell them the story of the Christmas fair, Aldith. It is nearly the season," and Wulfric was too small to remember it last year. Aldith set her spinning aside entirely, and settled herself more comfortably on her stool. She looked into the fire for a moment, gathering her thoughts, the way all good storytellers did, and then she began. "When your grandmother was a young woman," she said, and her voice took on the particular cadence that medieval people used when telling a story, slower and more deliberate than ordinary speech, there came a winter so cold that the river Ouse froze solid from bank to bank. It froze so thick that a man could walk across it, and then so thick that a horse could cross, and then so thick that carts could be driven across the ice. And when the merchants in the town of York saw that the ice would hold, they had a great idea. They said, "Why should we sit in our shops when the river is a great highway of ice? Let us have a fair upon the ice itself." Wulfric had turned his head to watch his mother now, his small face rapt. And so, Aldith continued, they built stalls upon the ice. They set up trestles and tables. They roasted meat over fires that they built upon iron plates laid on the ice. And the ice did not melt beneath the fires because it was so thick and so cold. There were bakers selling hot pies. There were merchants selling ribbons and needles and small toys carved from wood. There were minstrels playing pipes and drums, and people danced upon the frozen river as if it were the floor of a great hall. Your grandmother, who was 14 years old and unmarried, went with her father to the fair, and she said that in all her long life she never saw anything more wonderful. Wulfric's eyes were shining now in the firelight. Was there really such a fair, mother? Truly? Truly, Aldith said. Your grandmother told me the story many times before she died, and she was not a woman given to inventing things. She said that the ice was smooth as polished glass in the places where the merchants had cleared it, and she and the other young people slid upon it in their leather shoes as if they were skating, though of course they had no true skates in those days. She said that she saw a man who had come all the way from London with a dancing bear on a chain, and the bear stood upon its hind legs and danced upon the ice, while its master played a small pipe. She said that she saw a juggler who could keep 6 knives in the air at once, and though everyone was afraid he would drop them and cut off his own fingers, he never did. And did she buy anything at the fair? Hild asked, though she had heard this story many times before. She did, Aldith said, smiling. Her father bought her a small carved comb of horn, decorated with the shape of a flower. She kept that comb her whole life, and when she was very old, she gave it to me on the day I was married to your father. And when you are married, Hild, I will give it to you, and you will keep it. And perhaps one day you will give it to your own daughter. Hild's face grew serious at this, as it always did when the subject of her eventual marriage came up. She was 12 years old, and though marriage was still perhaps 3 or 4 years away for her, it was already something she thought about, something she had begun to imagine and to fear in equal measure. In the medieval village, a girl of her age was already beginning to be seen not only as a child, but as a young woman on the slow path toward becoming a wife. She would spend the next several years learning the skills she would need to run her own household, and when the right match was found, she would leave her parents' cottage and go to live in the cottage of her husband's family, or in a new cottage that the two of them would build together. It was the way of things. It was how the world worked. But it was also, for a young girl still curled at her mother's feet by the fire, a strange and unsettling thing to contemplate. Aldith saw her daughter's expression and, with the wisdom of a mother, changed the subject gently. Tell your father about the pattern you began on the blanket today, Hild. He has not seen it yet. Hild's face brightened, and she rose to fetch the piece of weaving she had been working on. It was a simple thing, a small blanket that would eventually serve as a wrap for a baby, though whose baby it might be, she could not yet say. She had been learning the more complex arts of weaving from her mother over the past year, and she had begun to attempt her first pattern, a simple repeating design of dark brown wool against a background of undyed cream. She unrolled it now beside the fire and spread it flat on her lap so that her father could see. Alwyn bent closer, and in the firelight he studied the small work. He was not a man given to lavish praise, but he was a man who knew good craft when he saw it, and after a long moment of examination he nodded slowly. "You have your mother's hands," he said. "The tension is even, and the pattern is true. This is fine work, daughter." Hild flushed with pleasure. It was the highest praise her father was likely to give, and she rolled the weaving up carefully and set it aside with the small, proud smile of someone who has been recognized for her craft. Aldith watched her daughter's face and thought, not for the first time, that whichever young man eventually took Hild to wife would be a fortunate man indeed. The evening deepened. The fire was fed with a smaller log now, since the family would soon be preparing for bed and there was no need to burn the wood at a great rate. Alwyn took up his draw-knife once more and returned to his work on the ash-handle. Aldith took up her spinning again. Godric, who had been silent for some time, now stirred and spoke. "Father, if the weather holds tomorrow, I might set the snares again. There was a good run of tracks in the hedgerow this morning." "Aye, do that," Alwyn said, "but mind the wind. If it turns to the north and the cold deepens, come back at once. Do not linger. I will not linger. And take your brother with you." Wulfric, who had been growing sleepy against his father's side, suddenly perked up. "Truly, father? May I go with Godric to check the snares?" "Aye, it is time you learned how it is done. But you will do exactly as your brother tells you, and you will walk in his footsteps in the snow so that you do not fall through into any hidden hollows. Do you understand?" "I understand." Alwyn exchanged another look with his wife, and Aldith gave the smallest of nods. It was a small thing, this permission for a 7-year-old to accompany his older brother on a task that took them beyond the immediate safety of the village. But it was, in the medieval way of raising children, an important step. Wulfric was old enough now to begin taking on responsibilities that went beyond the walls of the cottage. He was old enough to begin learning the skills that would keep him alive in the winters yet to come. He was old enough to begin his slow, gradual passage from being a child to being a boy, and eventually to being a young man, and eventually to being the head of his own household in his own turn. This was how it had always been done. This was how each generation was prepared for the life that awaited it. For the medieval peasant child had no schools to attend, no books to study, no formal instruction of any kind. Everything he needed to know he would learn by watching, by helping, by imitating, by being present at the work of the adults around him. A boy would learn to farm by walking behind his father through the fields from the moment he could keep up. He would learn to care for animals by helping in the byre. He would learn to hunt and to trap by accompanying his older brothers into the fields and forests. He would learn to fix things, to build things, to fell trees and to work wood, all by simply being there, by watching and by doing. The girl would learn to spin and to weave and to cook and to preserve food and to tend to the sick and to bring up children, all by working at her mother's side from the moment she was old enough to hold a spindle or stir a pot. There were no textbooks, no lectures, no examinations. There was only the slow, patient transmission of knowledge from generation to generation, hand to hand, voice to voice, through the daily rhythms of a life so ordinary that no one thought to write any of it down. And yet all of that knowledge was precious. All of that knowledge represented centuries of accumulated experience, refined by countless small experiments and adjustments, tested by the harsh judgment of survival. When a medieval mother taught her daughter which herbs would help a fever and which would harm, she was passing on knowledge that had been developed over generations of trial and error, that had been paid for in the lives of ancestors who had tested the wrong herbs and died. When a medieval father taught his son to read the sky for signs of an approaching storm, he was sharing wisdom that had been earned by countless generations of farmers who had lost crops to storms they did not see coming. This was the great inheritance of the medieval peasant. Not gold, not land, not titles, but knowledge. Knowledge of how to survive. Outside, the wind had risen further. The moaning against the eaves had grown to a low continuous howl, and every so often a stronger gust would rattle the wooden shutters and send a puff of cold air whistling through the gaps around the door. Aldith rose and moved to check that the door was properly barred. Then she pressed a rolled piece of old wool cloth against the largest of the gaps to help block the draught. When she returned to her stool, she was rubbing her hands together for warmth. "It will be a cold night," she said. "We should bring in the bedding closer to the fire." Alwyn nodded. On the coldest nights of winter, the family abandoned their normal sleeping arrangements and made pallets directly around the hearth, taking advantage of every degree of warmth that the dying fire could provide through the long hours of darkness. Tonight would be such a night. They could all feel it in the deepening bite of the cold. Godric rose and began to unfold the extra sleeping mats that were kept rolled and stored against the wall during the daytime. Hild helped her mother to move the piles of woolen blankets and the few precious furs closer to the fire. Wulfric, now fully awake again with the excitement of the change in the evening's routine, ran about small tasks with the eager helpfulness of small children everywhere. They arranged the pallets in a rough half-circle around the hearth, close enough that they could feel the heat of the fire on their faces even after the flames had died down to embers, but not so close that a spark could jump onto the bedding and start a fire. Fire in the wrong place was the great fear of every medieval household. A cottage of wattle and daub with a thatched roof could burn to the ground in a matter of minutes, and in winter such a disaster could easily mean death for the entire family. Every hearth was managed carefully. Every fire was watched. Every ember was accounted for. When the beds were arranged, Aldith went once more to the pot hanging over the fire and drew off a small measure of hot water into a clay jug. This she used to fill several smooth flat stones that had been warming near the hearth, wrapping each in a piece of rough cloth. These were the medieval version of a bed warmer, and they would be placed at the feet of the sleeping pallets to provide a small pocket of warmth against the coming cold of the night. She placed the largest and warmest stone at Wulfric's feet, since he was the smallest and would feel the cold most sharply. Hild received the next. Then Godric. Then Alwyn. Then, last, herself. Before they lay down for the night, there was one final ritual to perform. It was Alwyn's task, as the head of the household, and he approached it now with the same quiet solemnity with which he approached every important act of the day. He rose from his stool and moved to the hearth, and he knelt beside it for a moment, contemplating the fire. He was thinking about how to bank it. This was not a task to be done carelessly. The way in which the fire was arranged for the night would determine whether it survived until morning, and if it did not survive, then Alwyn would face the long, cold work of starting a new fire from flint and steel in the dark before dawn, and the whole family would suffer through a chill morning while they waited for the flames to build once more. He worked slowly. First he raked the glowing embers into a small mound at the centre of the hearth. Then he covered the mound with a thin layer of ash from the edges of the fire, taking care to cover the embers completely, but not to smother them. The ash would act as a blanket, insulating the embers and slowing the rate at which they consumed themselves. Beneath that gentle blanket, the small orange heart of the fire would continue to glow, patient and slow, breathing quietly through the long hours of the night, waiting for the morning when Alwyn would return to it, brush away the ash, and coax it back to full life with straw and kindling. If done correctly, a well-banked fire could keep its embers alive for 8 or 9 hours, sometimes more. If done poorly, the embers would either burn themselves out in a few hours, or worse, catch some stray piece of straw and start a fire that could not be contained. Alwyn had been banking fires since he was a small boy at his own father's side. He did the work now without conscious thought, his hands moving through the ancient gestures that had been performed in this same hearth for uncounted years, by his father and his father's father, and everyone who had lived in this cottage before him. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels and studied the small mound of ash for a moment, satisfied that it would hold through the night. Then he made the sign of the cross over the fire, a small quiet gesture, and murmured the traditional prayer that men in his village had murmured over their hearths for as long as anyone could remember. A prayer for the fire to keep, a prayer for the household to be safe, a prayer for the family to see the morning. The others were already settling onto their pallets. Aldith had helped Wulfric out of his outer tunic, and now had him tucked beneath a mound of woolen blankets with a small fur pulled up to his chin, the heated stone wrapped in cloth pressed against his feet. Hild lay on the pallet beside her small brother, her own blankets pulled up, her dark hair spread across the rough pillow. Godric had settled on his own pallet a little further from the fire, since as a young man in the fullness of his strength he generated more of his own warmth and did not need to lie as close to the hearth as the younger children. Aldith took her place beside Wulfric, and Alwyn, when he had finished his prayer over the fire, took the last place at the outer edge of the family circle. For a long time no one spoke. The fire, now banked, gave off only the softest orange glow through its blanket of ash, and this glow was the only light in the cottage. The wind continued its steady howl outside. The wooden shutters rattled occasionally against their frames. Somewhere in the deep darkness of the village, a dog barked once, and then was silent. Aldith could hear the soft, even breathing of Wulfric already deep in sleep beside her, the small, quick breaths of a child who had been fully worn out by the excitement of the day. She could hear Hild's slightly deeper breathing on the far side of her brother. She could hear Godric shifting on his pallet, settling into a comfortable position. She could hear Alwyn's breathing, slower and heavier than the others, the breathing of a man whose body was exhausted from a full day of hard labour in the cold. She lay awake for a while, as she often did on these first nights of true winter. There was so much to think about, so much to worry about. The stores of grain and how far they would stretch, the health of the cow in her byre, the wolves that had come down from the high country, the health of the widow Quenber alone in her cottage down the path, the health of her own 3 children, particularly Wulfric, who was the smallest and most vulnerable. The prospects for the spring, the state of the seed that had been saved, the condition of the plough and the harness, 10,000 small concerns, each of them a thread in the great tapestry of survival that stretched from this night to the next spring and beyond. But eventually, the warmth of the banked fire and the deep tiredness of her own body drew her down into sleep. And she slept. The hours of the night passed slowly. Outside, the wind gradually died down, and the sky cleared. Stars appeared, brilliant and sharp, and the temperature dropped further. It was the coldest night of the season so far. Somewhere in the deep hours after midnight, a fox crossed the beaten path near the cottage, its paws silent on the packed snow, its breath rising in small clouds. It paused near the door of the byre, sniffing at the scent of the cow and the chickens within. But the walls were sound, and the door was barred, and there was no way in for a fox on this night. It moved on, disappearing into the shadows between the buildings, and the village returned to its silence. Inside the cottage, the small mound of ash at the centre of the hearth glowed faintly. The embers beneath it breathed slowly, consuming themselves at the patient rate that Alwyn had intended when he banked them. The family slept. Wulfric turned in his sleep and pressed himself closer against his mother's side. Hild murmured something unintelligible, and then was quiet. Alwyn snored softly. Godric slept without moving, in the deep, unbroken sleep of the young. Above them, the smoked hams and the plated onions and the bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and the smoke that still rose thinly from the banked fire continued its slow, patient work of curing them. And beyond the cottage, in every other home in the village, similar scenes were playing out. In the wheelwright's cottage, Wilfred and his family slept clustered around their own banked hearth. In the miller's larger house, John Miller and his wife and their 4 children were arranged in a similar half-circle around their fire, with 2 servants asleep on pallets in the corner. In the priest's small cottage beside the church, old Father Elfric slept alone, wrapped in a heavy woolen blanket, his prayer book on the small table beside his narrow bed. In the widow Quenber's cottage, the old woman slept beneath a mound of blankets with her small dog curled against her chest for warmth. In the manor house on its low rise, Sir Edmund and his lady slept in a great curtained bed with a feather mattress, warmed by a small fire in their private chamber, while below them in the great hall, the household servants slept on pallets before the dying fire of the main hearth. The entire village slept. The entire countryside slept. Across the whole of medieval England, and across France, and across the Holy Roman Empire, and across all the lands where winter had come, families were sleeping in this same way, gathered close around their small fires, wrapped in their layers of wool and fur, breathing quietly in the darkness. It was a great sleeping, a great pause, a great gathering in of energy and warmth against the vast indifference of the winter night. Dawn came slowly, as it always did in the depths of the year. There was no sudden brightening. There was only a gradual softening of the darkness beyond the shutters, a slow shift from black to deep grey to a paler grey shot through, with the first hints of cold blue. Alwyn woke first, as he always did. He lay for a moment on his pallet, feeling the deep cold of the cottage, feeling the ache in his shoulders from the previous day's work at the churchyard fence. Then he rose, moving carefully so as not to disturb the others, and made his way to the hearth. He knelt beside the small mound of ash and felt for its warmth with the back of his hand. It was still warm, still alive. He brushed the ash aside gently, exposing the small orange embers beneath, and they were still glowing. He had banked the fire well. He gave a small, quiet nod of satisfaction, took a handful of dry straw from the pile beside the hearth, and laid it against the embers. He leaned down and blew on it. Slowly, steadily, a thin curl of smoke rose. Then a whisper of flame. He added slivers of pine, then thicker twigs, then a small piece of oak. Within a few minutes the fire was alive again, small but healthy, and the first true warmth of the new day began to spread into the cottage. He crossed to the shutters and opened one of them a crack, and what he saw made him pause. The world outside was transformed once more. During the night a hard frost had settled over everything, and now, in the pale light of dawn, every branch and every fence post and every stone was coated in a thick white rime that glittered like broken glass in the low winter light. It was beautiful, in a stark and painful way. It was also a warning. A hard frost meant that the cold had deepened. It meant that the streams would be freezing over more thickly. It meant that the ground was becoming as hard as iron. It meant that the true grip of winter had tightened. Alwyn stood at the window for a long moment, watching the pale gold of the rising sun spread slowly across the frost-covered village. Smoke was beginning to rise from other chimneys now, thin grey threads climbing into the cold blue sky, evidence that other men in other cottages were performing the same morning ritual, coaxing their own banked fires back to life. The world was waking. The village was waking. Another day of medieval winter was beginning, and with it another round in the endless slow contest between human ingenuity and the vast indifferent power of the cold. He turned from the window and looked back at his sleeping family, and something quiet moved through his chest. Aldith was still asleep beside Wulfric, her arm curled protectively around the small boy. Hild had turned in the night and now lay curled on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek in the way she had slept since she was a baby. Godric slept on his pallet against the wall, his young man's face relaxed in a way that it never was when he was awake. They were all there, all 5 of them, all warm, all breathing, all alive. This in the end was what medieval winter was really about. Not the cold, not the darkness, not the scarcity of food or the shortness of the days. All of these were merely the terms of the test. What winter was truly about was this quiet morning moment, when a father could stand by his window in the pale light of dawn and look at his sleeping family and know that they had survived another night, that the fire had held, that the wolves had not come, that the sickness had not descended, that the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations of ancestors, passed down through the countless small acts of daily labour and daily care, had once again proven sufficient to shelter this small circle of human warmth against the vast and ancient night. The Ishcombes would go on to face many more mornings like this one. The winter of 1348 would prove to be a hard one, though not the hardest they would ever know. There would be a bitter cold snap in late January that would take the life of old Father Elfric, who would be found frozen in his cottage one morning, having apparently died in his sleep of no cause more sinister than the accumulated weight of 60 winters. There would be a difficult stretch in February, when a coughing sickness would move through the village, and small Wulfric would catch it and burn with fever for 4 terrible days before finally, mercifully, his fever broke and he began to recover. There would be a moment in early March when the last of the grain in the wooden chest by the door would run alarmingly low, and Aldith would have to trade one of her precious wheels of cheese to John Miller for enough flour to see the family through the final weeks until spring. There would be a wolf killed at last in the sheepfold in late February, brought down by Osric's dogs and finished with a spear thrust by Osric himself, and the men of the village would carry its stiffening body through the streets to be nailed to the manor gate as a warning to its kin. But the family would survive. All 5 of them would see the coming of spring, and when at last the first green shoots pushed through the mud in the small garden plot behind the cottage, and the first migratory birds returned to sing in the branches of the leafless trees, and the streams broke free of their ice and ran once again with clear cold water, the Ashcombes would emerge from their long confinement lean and pale and blinking in the strengthening sun, and they would set immediately to the work of the new year, and no one would speak much of what the winter had been like, because there was no need. Everyone had lived it. Everyone had felt it. Everyone had earned, by the simple fact of their survival, the right to face another spring. This was the great cycle of medieval life. Winter and spring, want and abundance, darkness and light, endless labour and quiet rest, all turning together in a great slow wheel that had been turning since long before anyone could remember, and would keep turning for centuries yet to come. The Ashcombes would live out the rest of their lives within that turning wheel. Alwyn would eventually grow too old to work the fields, and would spend his final winters sitting by the hearth carving small wooden animals for his grandchildren, until one cold morning he would simply not wake up, and Aldith would find him peaceful in his sleep, and she would close his eyes and cross his hands over his chest and send word to Godric, who would come with his own family from his own cottage a few doors down. Godric would inherit the family plot, and he would take his father's place in the affairs of the village, and he would in his turn teach his own sons the ancient arts of the fire and the field. Hild would marry a young man from a neighbouring parish when she was 15 years old, and she would go to live in his cottage, and she would bear him 7 children, 4 of whom would live to adulthood, and she would keep her grandmother's horncomb her whole life, and she would eventually pass it to her own eldest daughter as her mother had passed it to her. Wulfric would grow up strong and become a wheelwright's apprentice under old Wilfrid, and he would take over the wheelwright's shop when the old man died, and he would become known throughout the parish as a maker of particularly fine waggon wheels, and he would live to see the century turn. None of them would ever be remembered by history. None of their names would ever be written in any chronicle or recorded in any book. When the last person who had known them was dead, they would be forgotten entirely, and the small cottage where they had lived would eventually fall into ruin, and centuries later a new house would be built on the same spot by descendants who had no idea that their own blood had first taken root there in the winter of 1348. This was the way of medieval life. This was the way of nearly all human life, for nearly all of human history. Not a story recorded in books, but a story lived in bodies. Not a legacy of monuments, but a legacy of survival. Not names carved in stone, but knowledge passed hand to hand, voice to voice, mother to daughter, father to son, generation after generation, in the small warm circles of firelight that persisted against the vast and ancient darkness. And so, as we come to the end of our long journey through this single medieval winter, perhaps we can pause for a moment and consider the strange and quiet miracle of our own comfort. You are lying in a warm bed. The temperature in your room has been adjusted to something close to perfect. There is food in your kitchen that could feed a medieval family for a week. There is light at the touch of a switch. There is water at the turn of a tap. There is medicine within easy reach. There are voices in your ear from thousands of miles away whenever you want them. There is warmth that never fails. There is safety that never wavers. All of these things would have seemed like the wildest magic to Alwyn Ashcombe. All of these things would have been beyond the understanding of Aldith and her children. All of these things are gifts that we receive without effort, without labour, without even conscious awareness. We turn a dial, we flick a switch, we open a door, and warmth appears, or light appears, or food appears, and we barely notice the miracle of it, because we have known nothing else. Perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might spare a small thought for the Ashcombs and for all the countless millions of medieval families like them, who spent their winters huddled around small fires, wrapped in layers of wool, telling stories to each other in the long dark evenings, watching over each other, holding each other, keeping each other alive through the great annual test of the cold. Their lives were unimaginably harder than ours. Their comforts were unimaginably fewer. And yet they lived, and they loved, and they raised their children, and they sang their songs, and they told their stories, and they survived. And because they survived, we are here. Every one of us alive today is descended from a long unbroken line of ancestors who made it through medieval winters just like this one, or through winters that were even harder, in centuries even more distant. Every one of us carries in our own blood the accumulated survival of 1,000 generations who tended their fires and hoarded their grain and taught their children the ancient arts of endurance. Tonight, in your warm bed, you are the living proof that they succeeded. Every warm breath you take is a small, quiet monument to their long labour. Every soft blanket that covers you is a small, quiet echo of the woolen blankets that once covered them. Every dream that comes to you as you slip into sleep is a small, quiet gift from all the mothers who ever sang their children to sleep in the flickering light of a medieval hearth. So let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let your body sink into the mattress. Let the small warm circle of your own present life expand outward until it touches, however faintly, the small warm circles of all those distant lives, all those distant firelights, all those distant families, sleeping through their long medieval winters 700 years ago and more. They kept their fires burning. They kept their families alive. They passed on what they knew, and here you are, at the far end of that long chain of care, resting quietly in the safety they could not have imagined, but for which they laid the very foundations. If you have enjoyed this journey tonight, do consider leaving a like or subscribing so we can keep making these long, slow stories together. Leave a comment with your location if you feel inclined, so we can know where in the world this voice has travelled tonight. But for now, close your eyes. Let the story fade. Let the wind and the fire and the sleeping village drift away into the deep quiet of the night. And with that, close your eyes and drift off to sleep. Peace.